Some silences don't echo, they fracture. Harrison Ford hadn't set foot near that school in years. But one Tuesday morning, a sound cut through the city noise and found him anyway. It was her voice, small, breaking, one word, Grandpa. And that was enough. Enough to pull a quiet man back into the fire, not to fight, but to remind the system what it forgot. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe. They said it was procedure. A child dragged across the concrete courtyard of an elementary school in broad daylight, her wrists cuffed, her knees scraped, her voice breaking into pieces. And no one moved. Not the teachers behind the windows, not the parents sipping coffee by the fence, not even the kids, some of whom reached for their phones, not to help, but to film. She stumbled again, her tights tearing, blood blooming across the fabric like a quiet scream. The guard didn't pause. His grip stayed firm, mechanical. He pulled her forward by the chain between the cuffs, steel biting into skin, not meant for steel. Her backpack had already fallen off. Books lay scattered behind her like a trail of wreckage, and somewhere among them, a small pink notebook spun across the pavement. Its cover was frayed at the corner, a heart sticker peeled at the edge. The wind flipped it open to the first page. The handwriting was careful, uneven. Things I want to tell Grandpa Harrison when he visits. Lily tried to reach for it, but the chain locked short. Her fingers shook, brushing air. Behind her, someone whispered, "Is that the Ford girl?" I thought she was half something. One parent nodded. I heard she took something off a teacher's desk. Don't know what, doesn't matter. Their words weren't loud, but they hit like stone. Lily heard every syllable. She opened her mouth to speak, to say no, to scream the truth, but nothing came out. Just air, just silence. And that silence said more than her voice ever could. The man dragging her didn't look down, didn't ask a question. Just did his job. Hands trained to grab, lock, drag. The flag on the pole flapped lazily, as if mocking the stillness around it. Morning announcements echoed overhead. A cheery, automated voice wishing everyone a happy Tuesday. No one noticed the blood on the concrete. No one bent down to help. Halfway across the lot, Lily's leg gave again. Her body dropped. She cried out, not in pain, but in disbelief, that no one, not one of them, had reached for her. Her journal landed near the bike racks, open to a page she hadn't finished. A list of things she wanted to share, that she finally beat the level in her flight simulator game, that she drew a picture of his old plane, that she missed him, that she'd waited all week for this one morning. Because this morning he promised he'd come. She begged him, "Just once, Grandpa, come pick me up like the other grandpas do, just once." And he said yes, but he wasn't here yet. The sun hit her eyes as they entered the drop-off loop. She blinked. Through the sting of tears and glare, she spotted something across the street, a dark SUV, parked, still, driver's door cracked just slightly open. She squinted, barely breathing. "Help." Her voice was small, raw. "Help me, please." The guard yanked again. Her shoulder jolted backward. She whimpered, falling forward, the cuffs pulling tighter. Her skin had turned purple beneath the metal. Behind them, a row of students near the gym leaned against the wall, watching. One boy held his phone up, recording without blinking. A teacher pulled the curtain back just an inch from the second floor. Their eyes met. Then the curtain dropped. Lily's chest clenched, not from pain, from truth. No one would stop this, not today. And across the street, the man in the SUV lowered the warm paper bag in his hands, the one that held her favorite apple turnover. The one he'd driven across town at sunrise to pick up. The one she always asked for when she saw him. The door creaked wider. He hadn't seen her yet, but he'd heard something, something buried beneath city noise, a voice, her voice. She didn't know it yet, but the moment had already shifted, because that SUV didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to a man who once crash-landed a plane and walked away calm. A man who had played 100 heroes on screen and still insisted real life required more quiet than action. A man whose silence had more gravity than most people's rage. His name was Harrison Ford. And this morning, he came early. The engine was still running. A quiet hum beneath the morning static. Inside the SUV, Harrison Ford sat with one hand resting on the paper bag in his lap. The smell of cinnamon and baked apples lingered in the air. He'd picked it up from that old corner bakery Lily loved, the one that opened before sunrise. He'd been there when they unlocked the doors, not because he had to, but because she'd asked. Just once, she said, pick me up like the other grandpas. So he did. He came early. He didn't expect this. The first thing that pierced the quiet wasn't a scream. It was her voice, thin, cracking, not quite loud enough for the street, but sharp enough to slice through glass. Help me, Grandpa. The words landed like a switch flipped inside him. He turned slowly toward the sound. Through the windshield, the sunlight splashed across the schoolyard, too bright, too ordinary. But there she was, Lily, dragged by the wrists, her knees red, her face pale with disbelief. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He opened the door and stepped out, and everything around him changed. The father walking his kindergartner froze mid-step. A teacher fumbling keys near her car paused without knowing why. The delivery driver adjusting crates of milk turned instinctively, eyes narrowing as if sensing a shift in pressure. It wasn't noise that changed them. It was weight, the kind that moved without movement. Harrison's boots hit the pavement with the calm of a man who'd faced storms before and walked through them. He didn't look panicked. He didn't shout, but the air thickened. Inside the car, the bag rustled gently as the door swung wider. The pastry still warm, uneaten. The last time he'd seen Lily cry, she was 7. She'd fallen off her bike on a gravel road near his Wyoming ranch. Her elbow scraped, lips trembling, not from pain, but from embarrassment. He remembered kneeling beside her, holding her wrist with the care of someone who knew how quickly small injuries turn into big silences. He said it then. You don't have to hide your tears from me, Lily. Not you, not ever. That memory slipped between his thoughts now as he crossed the street. 50 yards away, the guard kept pulling her like she was property, like she didn't matter, like she wasn't someone's entire world. And Harrison didn't rush. He walked. One step, another, every movement deliberate, measured, grounded. The sun caught on the lines of his face. The age in his eyes wasn't weakness, it was weight. Years of silence, of having seen too much and speaking only when it counted. People nearby started noticing, not who he was, but what he carried. Not the name, not the fame, but the gravity. A kid sitting on a bench with headphones looked up, lowered his phone, unsure what he was feeling. A janitor sweeping the far walkway paused mid-motion. Across the yard, a teacher standing behind glass slowly pulled her phone down, gaze locked on the man crossing the street like time didn't apply to him. And for one suspended moment, everything held its breath. Because while the world saw just a grandfather, those who paid closer attention noticed something else. The stillness wasn't just calm, it was learned, forged. The kind born in cockpits going dark, in altimeters falling fast, in engines failing over tree lines. Harrison Ford didn't break under pressure. He listened, he adjusted, and he acted when no one else did. And today he had heard the one voice he could never ignore. He walked past the open gate, and the silence followed. The courtyard was still, not quiet, still. The kind of still that presses on your ears, makes you aware of your own breath. The sound of shoes scuffing pavement had stopped. The wind held its place. Even the flag above the school, which moments ago had flapped lazily, now hung limp in the air, like it too was waiting. Harrison Ford stepped onto the concrete, his boots crossing the painted drop-off lines without urgency. He moved with the certainty of a man who didn't need to ask who was in charge. He simply was. Ahead, the guard kept pulling Lily forward, unaware, focused, robotic. But when the space around him shifted, when the air seemed to press in from all sides, he slowed, not because he understood what was happening, but because some primal part of him felt it. The shift, he turned and froze. Harrison didn't raise his hand, didn't change expression. He simply looked at the man. Eyes level, voice low, let her go. The words didn't echo, they landed. The guard blinked, confused, like he wasn't sure if he'd heard right. Sir, we're just following, let her go. There was no shout, no threat, just that voice, worn smooth by time and trimmed down to only what mattered. The kind of voice that didn't argue. It concluded. Lily stumbled again, her knees giving. The chain between her cuffs jerked tight, and she gasped. Harrison stepped forward, not fast, but closer. His presence filled the space between them like gravity. His eyes never left the guard. 5. The number was soft, too soft to be a command, but it dropped like a stone. 4. The guard shifted his feet. He looked around, searching for someone to step in. No one moved. Teachers at the window shrank back. A parent across the loop lowered their phone. 3. The second guard near the office watched, saying nothing. He didn't raise his radio. He didn't move to help, but his jaw tightened. 2. Lily's body sagged again. Harrison moved instinctively, catching her gently beneath the arm. He held her upright without looking down, his hand steady. Her head leaned against his side. 1. The chains slackened. The guard let go. The cuffs remained on her wrists, but the grip was gone. Harrison didn't say thank you. He didn't nod. He didn't blink. He simply stood there. Lily, trembling, tucked close to him, her hands still bound but safe. He looked down at her only then. Are you hurt anywhere I can't see? She shook her head, not because she was sure, but because she couldn't find her voice. Harrison turned back to the guard, just for a second. The man flinched, but Harrison said nothing. He didn't need to. Silence had done its work. He crouched beside Lily, inspecting her knees. Blood had crusted over one. Her sock was torn. Her journal lay a few feet away, the heart sticker half torn, page open to the list she never got to read. Harrison reached for it slowly. He didn't brush off the dirt. He didn't close it. He folded it gently under one arm. Then he lifted her, not quickly, not dramatically. He held her like something irreplaceable. Her legs dangled, scraped. Her breath hitched. He adjusted her carefully so her arms wouldn't press against the cuffs. The courtyard was still frozen. A child, maybe 9, standing near the bench with his backpack half-zipped, whispered to no one in particular. He didn't even raise his voice, and the whole school stopped breathing. The house sat deep in the trees, quiet and distant. No signs, no gate, just a gravel road that wound its way through pines and disappeared into silence. It didn't look like much from the outside, an old cabin with a metal roof and a rusted wind vane, but inside it was cleaner than expected. Sparse, not cold, just intentional, every object in its place. Every book, every tool, every photo lined with a care that didn't call attention to itself. Lily sat on the edge of the leather couch, her sleeves pulled over her bruised wrists. She didn't say much on the drive. Just looked out the window and clutched the notebook he'd handed back to her, the one with the blood-smudged heart and unfinished list. Now it lay beside her, unopened. She didn't look at it. Harrison walked in from the kitchen with a bowl of warm water, a clean cloth draped over his hand. He knelt without a word, dipped the cloth, and began cleaning the blood from her knee. His touch was gentle but certain. She winced once. Then again, he didn't flinch. He didn't ask her to be strong. He didn't ask her to explain. He just kept wiping. Her voice came out small, cracked. Are you disappointed in me? He didn't look up. He folded the cloth once, turned it, and said quietly no. She hesitated, her eyes filling again. But I cried, I froze, I didn't fight back. He rinsed the cloth, wringing it out slowly. The people at that school, he said, should be afraid. Not because of what you did, but because they made you think you had to ask that question. She blinked. He looked at her steady. That's not weakness, Lily, that's damage, and it doesn't belong to you. She didn't respond. But her fingers reached for the edge of the couch, grounding herself. He stood and walked into the next room. There was a desk, plain, dustless. A black phone sat on top, the kind with no apps, no touch screen, just numbers and silence. He picked it up and pressed a single button. The line clicked. A pause, then a voice answered. Yes, sir. Harrison's gaze didn't move from the window beyond the desk, where the woods stood tall and the sky had begun to gray. Start with the school, he said. A pause on the other end. Parameters, everything, another pause. A shift in tone. Understood. Deploying, he hung up. Behind him, Lily sat quietly on the couch, tracing the tear in the notebook's cover with her thumb. Harrison pressed his hand against the side panel of the bookcase. There was a soft click. A section of the wall slid open. The space beyond wasn't large, but it was alive. Screens lit up one by one. A humming server stack came online. Cables blinked with encrypted signals. A soft fan began to whirl beneath the floorboards. Inside the room, a narrow desk, 3 chairs, and a corkboard already lined with red pins and names long since crossed out. He stepped into the glow of monitors flickering to life. The war room hadn't been touched in years. But it remembered how to breathe, because Harrison Ford wasn't just a man who flew planes and told stories. He was someone who never forgot how to fight. He was someone built for what came next. The room pulsed with quiet electricity. Screens flickered, fans hummed, a low, constant rhythm of information moving faster than voices ever could. Harrison stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, eyes scanning each display with the calm of someone who had seen too much to be shocked, but just enough to know when something was wrong. Really wrong. The team worked without needing instructions. A young woman in a black hoodie leaned over the primary terminal, her fingers gliding across the keyboard. She didn't ask questions, she just typed. Behind her, two others filtered through digital folders like surgeons looking for a buried wound. 43 student suspensions in one semester. Of those, 37 were black or Latino. The woman at the keyboard frowned. That's not just disproportionate, that's systemic. A second screen blinked to life. Facial recognition logs from school cameras. A heat map began forming, red clusters where disciplinary incidents were concentrated. A pattern was emerging. Not based on behavior, but geography, classroom, staff, time of day, and name. They found an internal memo next, dated 18 months earlier, buried in a string of custodial reports. The subject line was simple: detainment flow. Inside, one sentence stood out: delay parent contact until after student is secured. Avoid interference. That's what it said. Written plain as weather, no shame, just instruction. The room went still for a beat. Harrison's jaw didn't tighten. His voice didn't rise. But the silence that followed was heavier than steel. Another file surfaced. An incident flagged by a junior teacher, name redacted, who had submitted concerns about racial bias in classroom referrals. Her email was ignored. 3 weeks later, she was reassigned to a different school on the edge of the district. Then came the video logs, or rather, the absence of them. On the day Lily was detained, several hallway cameras had gone dark. Not all, just the ones near the faculty lounge and classroom 3C. The timestamp gaps were exact. 11 minutes of blank footage. The technician called it a scheduled firmware reset. No one in the room believed that. The woman in the hoodie leaned back, eyes scanning the timeline. They knew, she said, they knew someone would ask eventually, so they deleted the evidence before the questions came. Harrison didn't nod. He didn't speak. He just looked at the screen showing the camera grid, where tiny boxes marked unavailable stared back like shut eyes. The reports kept coming. One child with autism restrained for non-compliance after asking to use the bathroom. A black 7th grader accused of shoving a teacher. Turns out the teacher had tripped. No correction ever issued. Another memo, this one colder. Zero tolerance must be enforced regardless of context. Fast action prevents escalation. Avoid delays caused by subjective interpretation. It wasn't policy, it was design. Harrison finally spoke, quiet, precise. They weren't careless, they were consistent. The room stopped. He stepped forward, pointing to the screen that showed the staff roster. Find out who authored these, not just the name at the bottom, who approved, who circulated, who stayed quiet. The woman nodded. We're on it. In the background, the printer came to life, spitting out a report marked confidential. The cover page bore the school district's logo. Underneath, a single line in bold. Faculty misconduct review, internal use only. It had been buried in a mislabeled folder, but not lost. It was all there, all of it. The discipline, the silence, the repeat offenders, the excuses. And now Harrison Ford stood in the center of the room, not with rage, but with resolve. The kind that doesn't burn, it freezes. The kind that turns silence into evidence, that turns patterns into proof. The kind that turns a quiet man into a reckoning. The office was too cold, not from temperature, but from something deeper. The air inside hummed with fluorescent lighting and tension that clung to the walls like dust. The chairs were arranged in a perfect semicircle, clipboards stacked neatly, files labeled in block letters, but no one reached for them, no one touched their coffee. Harrison Ford sat with Lily beside him, her hands folded in her lap. sleeves pulled down over her wrists. She hadn't spoken since breakfast. Her eyes fixed on the floor, not blinking. She didn't want to be here. She didn't want to remember. Principal Halbert sat across from them, shifting slightly in his seat, his tie just a little too tight. To his left was Miss Gibbons, mid-40s, posture stiff, lips pursed in polite restraint. Her nameplate gleamed under the overhead light like a badge she wasn't quite sure how to wear. "Let's not make this more dramatic than it already is," she said, clearing her throat. "We followed protocol. I merely reported what I saw." "Speak plainly," Harrison said. Gibbons straightened. "Yesterday morning, I noticed Lily standing near my desk. I had just returned from the hallway. A few minutes later, I realized my watch was missing, an heirloom, valuable. I followed procedure and contacted school security." Harrison's gaze didn't shift. "Did you speak to her, ask her anything?" Gibbons hesitated. "No, I did not confront her. I did what we're trained to do." He looked at Halbert. "And you allowed your staff to detain a 10-year-old child in handcuffs based solely on suspicion?" The principal's voice faltered. "In cases involving valuable items and when the student does not comply with initial questioning." "She's 10, Harrison said." The words landed flat and heavy, not loud, not sharp, just enough. Silence pressed into the corners of the room. Lily still hadn't looked up. Her fingers gripped each other like they were holding her together. No one said what they were really thinking, that she looked like she might be trouble, that she was quiet, that she didn't match the school photo catalog, that she was brown in a building full of beige. "Has this school had prior incidents involving minority students?" Harrison asked. The woman from the state board flipped a folder open. "Yes, 2 settled complaints in the last 3 years. A third is currently pending. And you?" He turned back to Gibbons. "You saw her standing near your desk, then your watch went missing." She nodded once. "Did you ask her?" "No." "Why?" "Because it was easier," he said, quieter. She pressed her lips together. "Because it was faster." She didn't reply. "Because in your mind that was enough." The room held its breath. Then the door opened. A boy entered, pale, maybe 10, thin shoulders. He looked at Lily. She didn't look back, but something shifted in her posture, like she already knew. The boy's voice cracked. It was me. I took the watch. I thought it would be funny, like a prank. But then they started yelling, cuffing her, and I froze." He swallowed. "I didn't think they'd do all that." Still no one moved. Harrison turned toward him. "What's your name?" "Simon." "How old are you?" 10. "Do you understand what you did?" Simon nodded, tears already welling. Harrison crouched, eye level now. "When you saw her hurting, when you saw them dragging her away, and you said nothing, that wasn't just a prank." Simon's chin quivered. "That was a decision," Harrison said. "You didn't just take a watch. You let someone else bleed for you. You hid behind silence while she cried in front of a crowd." Simon tried to speak, but couldn't. A tear dropped onto the carpet. He turned, walking out slowly, his head low. No one spoke, not the principal, not Gibbons. Lily looked up for the first time. Harrison turned to her, voice gentler now. "You didn't do anything wrong." She didn't answer, just nodded once. The truth had been spoken, and no one in that room knew how to sit with it. The crowd had gathered before sunrise, reporters adjusting mics, cameramen testing focus, producers whispering timing cues into earpieces. A podium stood just outside the school gate, surrounded by caution tape, camera flashes, and tension so thick it hummed beneath the wind. Behind the gates, the school looked as it always did, bland brick, clean glass, flags in place. But today, everything felt different. Something had cracked, and everyone was waiting to see what would come through. Harrison Ford stood just behind the podium. He didn't adjust the mic. He didn't hold a statement. The district had prepared one for him, polite, rehearsed, lined with phrases like unfortunate misunderstanding and swift internal review. He hadn't touched it. Beside him, Lily stood silent. Her wrists were free now, but the bruises remained beneath the sleeves of her cotton sweater. She looked down, not at the cameras, not at the crowd, at the ground. A reporter raised a hand. "Mr. Ford, do you?" Harrison stepped forward. His voice was quiet, clear, final. "She doesn't need your forgiveness," he said. "She needs your change." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed flat and sharp, the way truth does when it no longer waits for permission. Some reporters leaned forward. unsure if they'd heard him right. This child, my granddaughter, was humiliated, not because anyone had proof, not because anyone followed reason, but because no one asked a question. No one paused long enough to see her. They followed routine and silence. He scanned the crowd. You want to say sorry, you want to apologize because it helps you sleep at night. But I didn't come here to help you sleep. I came here to help her heal, and that begins with accountability. Behind him, one of the news vans lit up. A red alert on their internal system blinked. Another reporter's phone buzzed, then another, then another. Within seconds, the first outlet broke the headline. School district data leak confirms long-standing discrimination patterns. Hundreds of files, internal emails, staff memos, and sealed settlements had just been verified and released to the public. Anonymous source, untraceable, but complete. One document showed a student with a medical condition physically restrained after asking to use the restroom. Another revealed a complaint filed by a black mother, her son accused of aggression after raising his voice in class. No staff consequences. Another showed 3 different teachers suggesting a student be transferred simply because he made others uncomfortable. All dated, all signed. There was no longer room for doubt. The system hadn't made a mistake. It had followed design. And still, Harrison kept speaking. You want to say this was an error, a breakdown in communication, but it was. This was a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. Fast, brutal, quiet. He turned slightly toward Lily, who hadn't moved. You want her to forget. You want this to go away, but you can't unsee her. You can't erase her voice now that it's been heard. A television anchor whispered into her mic. We are witnessing a full collapse in district leadership. Then in another feed, something else cut in. A video. A teacher, mid-30s, blonde, shaking. Standing outside her car, looking straight into a lens. Her voice trembled. Years ago, I saw something like this. A boy accused of theft. He didn't do it, I knew, but I didn't speak up. I told myself it wasn't my place. That I needed my job. I kept my head down. She paused, holding back tears. But watching that girl, what they did to her, I should have said something back then. I should have shouted. And I didn't. I'll carry that for the rest of my life. The feed cut back to the school gates. Harrison didn't flinch. He didn't react to the cameras or the breaking news or the growing storm behind the scenes. He looked back to the podium, then to the reporters. You want to make this about damage control, but there's no control left to keep. She doesn't need your forgiveness, he repeated. She needs your change. And then he stepped back. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't wait for another question. He turned toward Lily, took her hand, and walked away. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was the sound of a reckoning that had finally arrived. The sky was pale that morning, not stormy. Not bright, just still. A quiet gray spread over the school like the air itself didn't want to speak too soon. No one said it, but everyone felt it. The weight of something returned, something unfinished. Lily stepped out of the car slowly. Her sleeves were pulled over her wrists, her backpack light, her shoes clean. She didn't glance toward the reporters still stationed near the front gate. Fewer now, but still there, hoping for a second headline, a follow-up shot. A moment of emotion they could sell, she gave them none. Harrison stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, not guiding, not shielding, just present, just there. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken much that morning. He didn't need to. The security guard at the front gate wasn't the same one. That man had been reassigned. The new one nodded quietly and stepped aside, no questions, no clipboard. Inside, the hallways hadn't changed. The paint was the same, the lockers still dented in the corners, but the sound was different, hushed, measured, as if everyone had forgotten how loud they used to be. Lily walked past the bike racks where her backpack had been torn from her shoulder. The scuff marks were still faintly visible on the concrete. A boy by the water fountain looked up, then looked away, said nothing. Another student, older, stood near the classroom door. He made eye contact, just for a second, then gave a small nod. Not mockery, not pity, something closer to respect. She didn't nod back. She didn't stop. Every footstep was quiet but steady. Her head didn't bow. Her eyes didn't dart. She walked the hallway like she belonged there, because she did. She reached her locker, opened it slowly, reached in, then pulled the pink notebook back out. Its spine had been taped, stitched along the tear, the cover still worn but whole. She turned toward the classroom and stopped. At the front of the room, without waiting for instruction, she stepped onto the platform, didn't ask for permission, didn't clear her throat. She just opened the notebook to the first page. The handwriting was new, still blocky, still hers. She looked out across the classroom, no one moved. The teacher didn't interrupt. Then she read it, just one line, "I'm still me," and then she closed the book. She walked to her seat, sat down. Outside, a reporter called out to Harrison as he turned to leave. "Mr. Ford, will you be suing the district? Is there legal action coming?" He stopped, didn't turn. His voice was low, plain. "I didn't come here to win lawsuits," he said. "I came here so no one forgets. So the next time a teacher reaches for the curtain, they hesitate. So the next time a parent hears shouting, they step forward. So the next child isn't left alone." Then he walked to his truck. No press, no papers, no sound. Behind him, the school remained still. But inside that classroom, something had shifted. One boy at the back sat straighter. Another girl tightened her grip on her pencil. No one spoke. But something silent had been broken, not destroyed, replaced by something stronger. Lily opened her notebook again and kept writing. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.